In the last video, we outlined the three major areas we will be discussing. In this video, we'll be asking the question of what we can know about the historical Jesus. Now, the study of the historical Jesus is equivalent to the study of the New Testament. Now, when approaching the New Testament, we must first dispel of the notion that only the religious study this document. In reality, it's quite the contrary. The most prestigious universities have devoted themselves from their very beginning to the study of this document. As the Oxford historian Dermot McCulloch writes, "It has been perhaps the most thoroughgoing and sophisticated analysis of any set of texts in the history of human thought. Therefore, within this study, I wish to do nothing more than to repeat what is the standard view of secular historians about the person of Jesus." The man I'll be most often quoting from is Bart Ehrman from Princeton University. Not only is he a competent scholar, but he's also the leading attacker of Christianity. He's most famous for his popular books, and was quoted by both the prominent atheists Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, known for their seminal works The God Delusion and God is Not Great. Therefore, Bart Ehrman provides us with a scholarly source with absolutely no bias towards Christianity. Now, in our study, the first question we will be asking is there any historical evidence for the person of Jesus of Nazareth? To answer if there is any historical evidence for the person of Jesus of Nazareth, I will refer to Bart Ehrman. In this clip, he has just been awarded the Freedom from a Religion Award, an award for being a well-known atheist. After receiving the award, he took questions from the audience, and someone in the crowd asserts that she sees no historical evidence of Jesus, and this is how he replies.
There is a lot of evidence. I mean, there is so much evidence that it is not, I mean, I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody who, I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed.
In his book, Did Jesus Exist?, Bart Ehrman writes the following. "Every week I receive 2 or 3 emails asking me whether Jesus existed as a human being. When I started getting these emails some years ago now, I thought the question was rather peculiar and did not take it seriously. Of course Jesus existed. Everyone knows he existed, don't they? I'm not a Christian, and I have no interest in promoting a Christian cause or a Christian agenda. But as a historian, I think evidence matters, and the past matters, and for anyone to whom both evidence and the past matters, a dispassionate consideration of the case makes it quite plain Jesus did exist." In his book, he goes on to outline the criteria by which historians test historical data. That of early attestation, which is the fact that an event is more likely to be historical if it is reported in early records. Therefore, an event which is reported within 50 years of that event is more likely to be historical compared to a report of 100 years after the event. The other criteria is that of multiple independent attestation, which is the fact that an event is more likely to be historical if it has several independent reports. In his book, Bart Ehrman says the following about early attestation, that the information about Jesus in some of the sources we have can be dated back to 30 AD, the year of his death. These sources include material from Acts of the Apostles, material from the Pauline letters, and material from the Gospels, such as the Q source. Concerning multiple independent attestation, he lists 15 independent sources, giving us a great variety of sources that broadly corroborate many of the reports about Jesus without evidence of collaboration. And this is the list of the 15 sources. Now, a question that may now be asked is if 15 sources is good for the time and place of Jesus. Therefore, we should ask, how many sources do we have from the 1st century Palestine? Ehrman answers this in his book. As it turns out, this is astounding as it is true. From Roman Palestine of the entire 1st century, we have precisely only one author of literary texts whose works have survived. That one author is Josephus. We have no others. What is equally striking, in all our historical records, we know the name of only one other author of such writings, a man named Justin Tiberius. His books obviously have not survived. Therefore, for 100 years, we only have one source for the entire region of Palestine, which is the man by the name of Josephus. Therefore, this one source for Palestine enables us to appreciate the 15 sources we have for Christ. This is why, in one interview, Bart Ehrman stated, "We have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from his time period." And Michael Grant, a Roman historian, writes, "No serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus, or at any rate very few, and they have not succeeded in disposing of the much stronger, indeed very abundant evidence to the contrary. Therefore, let us now return to our criteria. For our first point on the historical evidence for Jesus, we can say we have early attestation dating from the year of his death. We also have multiple independent attestation. And finally, we have the scholarly consensus that firmly holds that the existence of Jesus is known beyond a reasonable doubt. We will now move on to our second point, because even though we can confidently affirm the existence of Christ, surely the reports of miracles are evidence of later unhistorical embellishment. In other words, even though we can affirm the existence of Christ, surely the fact that he was a miracle worker is unhistorical. To this question, we will again apply the two methods of historicity, that of early attestation and multiple independent attestation. First, we will address early attestation. The best way to do this, I believe, is to compare Jesus with other historical individuals who allegedly performed miracles. For example, Muhammad, according to Islamic sources, at one time split the moon in two, flew on a donkey from Mecca to Jerusalem, and reportedly at times caused it to rain. However, most of the individuals who collected miracle stories about Muhammad lived between 100 and 200 years after Muhammad lived, meaning they were not eyewitnesses to Muhammad's life. 200 years is plenty of time for miracle legends to develop. The same can be said about Buddha, who at one time was reported to have done this miracle. Again, however, the books about Buddha and Buddhism were written 500 years after him. Now with Jesus, all historians are in agreement that all the accounts of Jesus are written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Therefore, this demonstrates that it is very unlikely that this is enough time for unhistorical mythical events to develop around Jesus. As one textbook writes, "Even 2 generations are too short a span to allow mythical tendencies to prevail over the hard historical core of oral tradition." Now we will move on to our second criteria, that of multiple independent attestation. For this point, I will quote Paula Fredrickson, a Jewish historian from Princeton University. In her book, she states, "We note that Jesus as an exorcist, healer, even to the point of raising the dead, and miracle worker is one of the strongest, most ubiquitous, and most variously tested depictions in the Gospels. All strata of this material, Mark, John, M tradition, L traditions, and Q, make this claim. This sort of independent multiple attestation supports argument for the antiquity of a given tradition, implying that its source must lie prior to its later manifold expressions, perhaps in the mission of Jesus himself." She later goes on to say that, "Yes, I think Jesus probably did perform deeds that his contemporaries viewed as miracles." Therefore, the point that she is making is that the miraculous stories of Christ do not derive merely from one source, but rather a multitude, which demonstrates that the most likely explanation is that these events are historically valid. An important note must be made here. Fredrickson, and as we shall see other historians, are not stating that Jesus was a supernatural healer. Such a claim obviously goes beyond the realm of historical analysis. However, what they are stating is that based on the historical evidence, it is clear that Jesus was known by his contemporaries as a healer. The Oxford historian A.E. Harvey, in his book Jesus and the Constraints of History, says that we can know beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus was known in both Galilee and Jerusalem, that he was a teacher, that he carried out cures of various illnesses and particularly demon possession, and that these were widely regarded as miraculous. John Dominic Crossan, a man who is not a Christian, but is perhaps one of the leading historians of the New Testament, writes, "You cannot ignore the healing and exorcisms. Throughout his life, Jesus performed healings and exorcisms for ordinary people." And next, our friend Bart Ehrman writes, "Whatever you think about the philosophical possibility of miracles of healing, it is clear that Jesus was widely reputed to have done them." And finally, the Oxford historian Marcus Borg, who is again not a Christian, writes, "Despite the difficulty which miracles pose for the modern mind, on historical grounds it is virtually indisputable that Jesus was a healer." Therefore, let us now return to our criteria and address our second point on the historical evidence for the miracles of Jesus. We can say that all accounts of Christ's miracles are within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. We can say that these miraculous accounts of Christ are found within a multitude of sources. And finally, there is again a scholarly consensus that Christ was known for miraculous activity. We will now move on to our final point in our analysis of the historical Jesus, that of his crucifixion. Before we delve into the issue of the historical evidence for the crucifixion, let us remind ourselves of the criterion of multiple independent attestation, which states that the more sources we have for an event, the more likely it is to be historical. Paul Maier from Harvard University writes the following: "Many facts from antiquity rest on just one ancient source, while 2 or 3 sources in agreement generally render the fact unimpeachable. Keeping this in mind, let us now consider the amount of sources we have for the crucifixion. All historians are in agreement that there are several accounts for the crucifixion. To list a few here, there are that from the Gospel of Mark and from the Gospel of John, from the Pauline corpus and from the Lucan source. There is also a source from the letter to the Hebrews, early creedal statements found within the New Testament, that from the Roman historian Tacitus, and from the Jewish historian Josephus." Tacitus writes, "Christus, from whom the name had its origins, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate." Josephus writes, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die." Gerd Ludemann, a leading German New Testament, who is not a Christian, states, "Jesus' death as a result of crucifixion is indisputable." John Dominic Crossan states, "That he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, since both Josephus and Tacitus agree with the Christian accounts on at least that basic fact." And finally, Bart Ehrman states that one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Therefore, let us return to our criteria and address our last point. We have multiple accounts that all testify to the crucifixion, and we have the scholarly consensus that it is beyond a reasonable doubt that Christ was crucified. To conclude this investigation on the historical Jesus, I will quote from Luke Timothy Johnson from Yale University, who writes, "Even the most critical historian can confidently assert that a Jew named Jesus worked as a teacher and wonder worker in Palestine during the reign of Tiberius and was executed by crucifixion under the prefect Pontius Pilate." We have therefore finished a detailed analysis on the historical Jesus. In our next video, we'll begin our discussion on the resurrection. This topic will be divided into 2 sections. We'll first use the scientific method to analyze the question of the resurrection, and then the historical method. Therefore, in our next video, I'll be discussing the scientific evidence for the resurrection.